The Addict's Confessional is one of the oldest continually operating popular forms of English literature. Drug addicts are not usually known to be creatures of restraint. It's fitting, then, that the Addict's Confessional has been the venue for some of the most interesting, extremely styled prose in English. I'm going to plot a line, not chronologically, but a stylistic line that runs between Tao Lin, the most famous 21st century exponent of the form, back to Thomas de Quincey, whose Confessions of an English Opium Eater kicked it off altogether. I'm going to make occasional stops at a couple of the great drug stylists. William S. Burroughs' Neb with St. Alban might get a look in, but I'm basically going to be focusing on de Quincey and Tao Lin. I find them the most conducive to general discussion of prose style and technique. I like them both a lot, and as far as extremes go, they're about as remote as you can get. In my last video of this type, I was talking about Hemingway, David Foster Wallace, and David Saleh. This is going to be similar in that we're going to find situations in common across both writers, in order to eliminate control variables. This should allow us, insofar as style and content are separable at all, to isolate style and talk about it more straightforwardly. To begin, here is Tao Lin describing a bus journey in his novel Taipei. The bus moved forward. Paul looked at the LED sign that said, "Next stop, Canal Street." He felt like he was inside a large, rectangular animal that didn't know it was alive. De Quincey has a whole essay about getting the bus. Similarly, he also describes it as like interacting with an animal. He does this in a pretty different way. The vital experience of the glad animal's sensibilities made doubts impossible on the question of our speed. We heard our speed, we saw it, we felt it as thrilling, and this speed was not the product of blind, insensate agencies that had no sympathy to give, but was incarnated in the fiery eyeballs of the noblest among brutes, in his dilated nostrils, spasmodic muscles, and thunder-beating hooves. The sensibility of the horse, uttering itself in the maniac light of his eye, might be the last vibration of such a movement. The glory of Salamanca might be the first. But the intervening links that connected them, that spread the earthquake of battle into the eyeballs of the horse, were the heart of man and its electric thrillings, kindling in the rapture of their fiery strife, then propagating its own tumults by contagious shouts and gestures to the heart of his servant the horse. The bus being an animal is of course not completely metaphorical for de Quincey, whose bus was pulled by horses. When Tao Lin describes his own experience on the bus in Taipei as feeling like he was inside a large rectangular animal but didn't know it was alive, we see a clear disconnect, not merely attributable to the advance of the combustion engine. De Quincey cannot describe anything except in extremes. Tao Lin cannot describe anything except as a kind of distraction from the boredom and anxiety beneath everything else. You'll notice that neither of these passages were about drugs. Both writers are certainly most famous for their writing about drugs and drug addiction, but I thought it good to start elsewhere, to show by comparison how, even when they are writing about drugs, they also aren't really writing about drugs, or at least not just writing about drugs. Drugs aren't even central to their experiences, they're an accidental side effect of alienation. Drugs are a consequence of their existence on the fringes of the urban societies that they inhabit. De Quincey, before he ever becomes an opium addict, is living on the streets of London, a runaway, wandering up and down Oxford Street and living among prostitutes. He includes this description of this lifestyle in the book Confessions of an Opium Eater. It's clearly linked to the same phenomenon for him. Tao Lin, similarly, he writes about robbing batteries from convenience stores to sell online to buy quinoa and this kind of thing, more than he writes about drugs in the early stuff before he becomes a drug novelist. Drugs arrive into the gap between the alienated individual and the world and kind of sew up the seam between the experience and the culture around you. The very different flavours of alienated style strike me as a pretty representative reflection of the cultures that they're written in opposition to. De Quincey is responding to a pretty stuffy Victorian temperament, unable to contain himself in his massive enthusiasm for the world, for individual people, for the wonders of travelling by bus, of wandering at night, of meeting friends, of treating the city as a site of living rather than a place for trade, while Tao Lin is responding to the kind of false enthusiasm he sees in contemporary America and Taiwan, by foregrounding boredom, Weltschmerz, anxiety, and the basic sensory surfaces of things. He lives in a world, our world, overburdened with calls to recognize the amazing essences of things in experience, and he reacts to that by describing pure, stripped-back surfaces. It's worth noting, also, that this is a pretty brief period of stylistic genius for both men. Quincey eventually became a straightforward English conservative, a little eccentric, but basically defined by being against the Whigs, while Tao Lin is now a sort of online guru, drawing mandalas and posting from a Robinsonian beach shack on Hawaii. The first experience which brings both writers to their peaks of description is, of course, the actual onset of drugs. When Quincey's writing about opium, he gets carried away in an insane crescendo. "O just, subtle, and mighty opium, that summonest to the chancery of dreams for the triumphs of suffering innocence, false witnesses, and confoundest perjury, and dost reverse the sentences of unrighteous judges, thou buildest upon the bosom of darkness, out of the fantastic imagery of the brain, cities and temples, beyond the art of Phidias and Praxiteles, beyond the splendour of Babylon and Hecatompylos, and from the anarchy of dreaming sleep, callest into sunny light the faces of long-buried beauties, and the blessed household countenances, cleansed from the dishonours of the grave. Thou only givest these gifts to man, and thou hast the keys of paradise, subtle, just, and mighty opium." He likes it an awful lot. He gets carried away. He thinks it's about ancient Greece. When Tao Lin writes about it in Taipei, so this is about the character Paul, but it's autofiction, so it's about the character Tao Lin as well. After blearily looking at the internet a little, then peeing and brushing his teeth and washing his face, he lay in darkness on his mattress, finally allowing the simple insistence of the opioid, like an unending chord progression, with a consistently unexpected and pleasing manner of postponing resolution, to accumulate and expand, until his brain and heart and the rest of him were contained within the same song-like beating of another, larger, protective heart, inside of which, temporarily safe from the outside world, he would shrink into the lunar city of himself and feel and remember strange and forgotten things, mostly from his childhood. There's a smile in the final sentence there, very indicative of the difference. Here he is, the opium eater, eating the opium. He's building up to a Quincey crescendo, talking about the lunar city of himself, feeling and remembering strange and forgotten things. It's not a million miles away from the art of Phidias and Praxiteles, the splendour of Babylon and so on like this. We could really hype ourselves up and go the whole hog, say we remember something from the world soul, say that the opium has connected us to, like, the history of beauty or the spirit of the world. But instead he says that it mostly reminds him of things from his childhood. Rhythmically, the phrase deflates the rhythm, flattens it all, and it isn't even sure of itself. He doesn't even just say, "I remembered my childhood." You know, he doesn't go to Quincey and say, "The opium made me remember the creation of the sun where I was present," or even just say, memoirically, "The opium brought me back to a state of infancy." Instead he says, a bit of it. I can't really remember. It wasn't that important to me. It's a little bit like saying, "I witnessed marvellous and wonderful scenes, mostly on TV," or something to that effect. No power, no force carried through the language, the relegation of essence back to surface. Tao Lin doesn't want you to think that he's too excited. He wants you to think maybe opium is actually quite a boring thing to eat. In the same book, he actually describes those feelings of childhood, the kind of defining feelings of his childhood, which then we feel again through the opioid. At a certain age, he remembered, he'd often lain motionless on carpet or a sofa, feeling what he probably viewed, at the time, as boredom, and what now seemed like ignorance of, or passive disbelief in, his forthcoming death, which would occur regardless of his thoughts, feelings, or actions in the unknown amount of remaining interim, upon a binary absorption from some incomprehensible direction taking him elsewhere. Briefly, without much interest, Paul intuited that if he were immortal, or believed he was, he might feel what he'd felt as a child, which seemed less enjoyable than obscurely unsatisfying, something he would want to be distracted from feeling. So he takes the opium. He was reminded of feelings from childhood. The defining feeling of his childhood is a kind of boredom, or passive disbelief in life. He's checking out of a world which is already boring to him, to rediscover a different kind of being bored. De Quincey was never once bored, you get the impression. Instead, you feel that everything in his life was felt very intensely, always exciting, but every day was a kind of set of new puzzles. His most famous writing is about self-administered anesthetics, and yet it's all very deeply about feeling. I'm not trying to mount one of the constant and incredibly popular attacks on modern boredom and minimalism that have come to stand in for conventional reactionary politics in America. I think Tao Lin's style, though at this point a little oversaturated, is very successful in its aim. I think it is in places genuinely the funniest vehicle for his thoughts, and I think that Taipei, Leave Society, and especially Richard Yates, were very exciting to me as a younger guy. They were my first taste, really, in late adolescence, of the idea that a contemporary literary culture was happening, the first idea that there were conflicts in style happening, out there, somewhere, in some imaginary salon. They alerted me to this conflict, though, because it's pretty apparent that nobody, absolutely nobody, could write this way if they weren't reacting to something. The idea that anybody would experience language as a speaker every day, talking to people, and listening to the language that they use, and then decide to write like a computer, slowly and deliberately scanning every inch of every room they were in, as boring as possible, is absurd, unless you place them in a literary culture so saturated with, to use the term from Zadie Smith's essay, Two Paths for the Novel, lyrical realism, the kind of quite mushy descriptions of sunsets and so on, that kind of dominated the early 2000s. And not to throw all of that away, Richard Powers is okay. That to deprive the reader of $10 word descriptions of sunsets, or clouds, or whatever, represents a challenge to the world as a whole, and becomes interesting by contrast, even though it's boring for what it is. My first proper encounter with Thomas de Quincey was at university, in second year. I had a supervision after the week's reading on him, and so I was around 19, and I arrived at the session with a bundle of notes about how I found him to be just so funny, so witty, so sympathetic to everyone, so human and joyous and so on, one of my favourites I'd encountered in the whole long 18th century paper. But in our two-person class, my supervision partner went first. What I thought, reading this, was that de Quincey typified my absolute least favourite type of Cambridge student, the self-satisfied, arrogant and ridiculous boys' schooler, so delighted with his own thoughts and feelings that he never bothers to learn what is really going on in other people's heads, or out there in the real world. It was a fair point, well made, and it was difficult to give my own reading in these circumstances. But I've nurtured a very fond feeling for him since, as a totally incapable lover of the world, who definitely overgeneralizes and considers his own perception supreme, but also refuses to take the things that other people take seriously at face value. Tao Lin writes flatly, where de Quincey writes like a deranged pervert, like a paraphiliac attempting to consummate his relationship with the English language. To call him maximalist would undersell the whole thing. Tao Lin's distance is obviously deliberate. That's the line that separates what he's doing as autofiction from autobiography or memoir, the way that de Quincey is doing it. The form has an artificial, deliberate distance implanted in it. Tao Lin's distance from his own life is a pretty clear indication of his tendency taking deep root. We can see that in some of the stylistic conceits of the rest of his novels. Picking another name, maybe most representatively in Richard Yates, he chooses to call him and his 16-year-old girlfriend after child stars Haley Joel Osment and Dakota Johnson, to say, this is an artificial version of my life, and the names I'm picking are going to be people who you have only interacted with through them playing other created characters, just layer and layer of artificial distance. De Quincey uses intertext as well. He's always referencing things. He's always quoting. In the passage about opium, he's quoting Thomas Browne as well as a bunch of Greek. But he's not a detached writer. He forces these intertexts in, but he does it because he thinks he lives in that world. His world is the books around him. He talks a lot about various writers, but that's because he doesn't, I don't think, he has quite a porous, separation between the things that he's reading and the actual life that he lives. He's involved in his own life, maybe too involved in his own life. It's just that his own life is mostly about ancient Greece. To conclude, both men's prose is defined by its style. In both cases, it's the style of, in a way that AA describes addicts, self-will run riot. Quincey cannot stop himself from following every thought to its most extravagant conclusion. Tao Lin cannot stop himself from stripping every thought to its most reductive one. These are not opposite impulses. They're the same impulse, expressed against opposite cultures. Style, like addiction, is what happens when a person cannot modulate their relationship to the world. To massively simplify everything, my feeling is that basically drug addiction is refusal to engage with the world in an unmediated way. The writer, functioning without conscious style, is kind of unmediating the world. He's transmitting observation straight to the reader with no spin attached. Such massive oversupply of style, then, from both men, is akin to intoxication because it interposes a new, strange thing, like a tinted lens, between the object of experience and the experience. Anyway, this was a fairly formless piece. I like both writers a lot. I think it's interesting to see how, 200 years apart, they're very different, but at the same time recognise that they're far enough apart that there are a lot of reasons for that, but they have a lot in common. I know the viable audience for this kind of thing is likely incredibly small, but if anybody reads either off of the back of this, I think that's pretty good going.